30 years is a long time to live in silence, especially when the silence comes not from strangers, but from your own flesh and blood. My son was once the center of my world, the boy I carried on my shoulders until my knees ached, the child whose stick figure drawings I pinned to the garage wall as if they belonged in a gallery. Yet for 3 decades he treated me as if I were a ghost, alive only in memory, inconvenient in the present. I remember the first years after he left, how I still checked the mailbox each afternoon with a foolish flicker of hope, thinking there might be a letter with his handwriting on the envelope. Instead, there were only bills, advertisements, and postcards from distant cousins who remembered holidays better than he did. His birthdays came and went. I bought cakes in those early years, lit a candle alone in the kitchen, whispering a quiet prayer for him before blowing it out. But over time, even that ritual felt hollow, like a stage play for an audience that had long since left the theater. When his children would have been young, I imagined them. I imagined their laughter, the way small voices might have called me Grandpa, though they never once did. I sent gifts, at first simple things, wrapped neatly: toy cars, books, sweaters chosen with care. More often than not, they came back unopened, returned with the cold efficiency of a stamped red notice, undeliverable, not because the address was wrong, but because my existence was being refused. Do you know what it feels like to be erased from your own family? It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic. It's deliberate, methodical, like being written in pencil and watching someone drag the eraser over you, slowly, steadily, until nothing remains but a faint smudge where a name once was. At first, I fought against it. I called. I left messages. Sometimes his wife answered, her voice clipped, polite in the way people are polite only when they want to hang up quickly. Eventually, she stopped answering altogether. My number must have been blocked, because the line would ring once and then cut straight into silence. I remember sitting there with the phone in my hand, staring at my reflection in the dark screen, asking myself what crime I had committed. My wife had already passed by then, and the house was too quiet, too big for one man. Grief comes in 2 waves: first when you lose the person you love, and again when you realize the people still living have chosen to lose you. Those 30 years were not completely empty, though they were hollow in places. I filled them the best I could. I volunteered for community drives, carried boxes of food when my back still allowed it. I planted roses in the yard, and each spring they bloomed stubbornly, as if to remind me that beauty insists on showing up even when you don't feel you deserve it. I read novels late into the night, sometimes falling asleep with the book sliding from my hand. I built birdhouses in the shed, crafted small things with my hands that I donated to neighbors, to schools, to parks. Somewhere, some child swung on a set I repaired, or some bird nested in wood I had cut. That thought carried me on harder days. But no matter what I did, the shadow remained, the knowledge that my only child had chosen absence. The pain dulled with time, the way an old fracture aches when the weather turns. At first it burned sharp, like a fresh wound. Then it lingered like scar tissue, not killing me, but reminding me daily of what I had lost. Neighbors and friends asked at first, with genuine kindness, "Where's your boy these days? Is he coming home for Christmas?" I forced a smile, gave vague answers, excused myself before the tears could betray me. Eventually, they learned not to ask. The silence around my son became an unspoken agreement, the kind small towns are skilled at keeping. And I carried on, my head high, my voice steady, even when my heart wanted to break. The cruelest part of estrangement is not the loneliness. It's the memory of closeness. I could still see his small hand gripping mine when we crossed the street, still hear his laugh when I pushed him on the swing, still hear the way he once called out, "Dad," with joy that had no conditions. Those memories aged with me, turned bittersweet. They were proof that something real had once existed, proof, too, of how thoroughly it had been abandoned. On the coldest nights, when the wind rattled the windows, I would whisper his name into the empty air just to prove my tongue still remembered its shape. I aged 30 years without hearing him call mine. Now I'm in my late 70s. My hair has gone silver, my hands stiff, my gait slower, but my spirit has hardened, like wood left out in the sun too long. Grief taught me how to survive. Silence taught me how to endure. And erasure taught me the art of resilience, the ability to live without expectation, to hold dignity even when no one is watching, to love without being loved back. 30 years, 30 birthdays, 30 unanswered letters. I stopped waiting at the window. I stopped setting the table for two. I learned that sometimes the only family you can count on is yourself. And yet, even now, after everything, I know this much. The story between us isn't finished. Not yet. It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that carried no weight of expectation. I had folded laundry in the morning, sat with my tea by the window as frost clung stubbornly to the glass, and made a list of groceries that could last me through the week. At my age, routines are anchors. They steady you when the rest of life feels determined to drift. But on that particular Tuesday, the anchor slipped. The mail came later than usual. I heard the creak of the postman's boots on my front steps, the quick thud of envelopes against the wooden slot. Most days, it was nothing worth rushing for. Catalogs I didn't ask for, donation flyers from organizations I already supported, and the occasional bill that reminded me the practical world still had its claim on me. But as I sorted through the stack, one envelope made my fingers stop. The handwriting on the front was painfully familiar. I hadn't seen it in decades, yet I knew it instantly, the slope of the letters, the pressure of the pen pressing too hard, as though the paper itself had been asked to bear the weight of resentment. My son. After 30 years of silence, his handwriting appeared on an envelope resting in my wrinkled hands. For a long moment I couldn't open it. I stared, my heart thudding in my chest like an old clock struggling to keep time. 30 years of nothing, and then this. The return address confirmed it, his city, his house, the place where he built a life without me in it. At last I slid a knife under the seal and unfolded the paper inside. "Dad," it began. The word looked foreign on the page, like a borrowed language. He wrote that he wanted me to come for Christmas, that the house would be full of family, warmth, and celebration, that after all these years, it was time to come together again. The lines were polite, but they felt rehearsed, an invitation drafted for witnesses, not for me. And yet I read every line 3 times, hunting for sincerity where my gut told me there was none, because the timing was too neat. Just 2 weeks earlier, the local paper had run a feature about me, about the charitable trust I had established quietly years ago, which had finally grown large enough to fund scholarships, support a shelter, and add a library wing. My name was printed under the headline, "Local Widower Turns Quiet Wealth into Public Good." A neighbor had dropped the clipping on my porch, proud to know me. I tucked it away, embarrassed more than anything else. But I knew how far newspapers traveled. Gossip, once loose, gathers speed like a downhill stone. And suddenly, after 3 decades of silence, my son reached out. The invitation didn't feel like reconciliation. It felt like calculation. I could almost hear his voice, the sharp tone he used as a boy when he wanted something he didn't want to earn. "He has money. Invite him. He won't refuse Christmas." The letter might have used words like family and forgiveness, but the ink read differently in my eyes. It didn't say he missed me. It didn't say he was sorry. It said only what I already knew. He didn't find me. He found my balance sheet. I folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. The paper felt heavier now, as though 30 years of absence had been crammed into a single page. My tea had gone cold on the table, but I didn't reheat it. I just sat there, staring at the envelope, my mind replaying every unanswered call, every unopened gift, every Christmas passed alone. Now, suddenly, I was invited not because the emptiness in his life had become unbearable, but because the column in the paper reminded him that the emptiness in his pockets could be filled by me. And yet, I didn't tear the letter apart. I didn't burn it like I had once imagined I might, if words came without apology. I kept it on the table long after the sun dipped behind the bare trees, because despite everything, a question pressed against my chest. Should I go? Not for him, and not even for myself, but for the part of me that still believed in showing up when others expected me to vanish. If he wanted a performance, I could give him one, but it would not be the script he had written. That night, Before bed, I placed the letter in the drawer where I kept important papers, not with the mementos of love, but alongside the contracts, the deeds, the will. That was where it belonged. When I turned out the lamp, the thought followed me into the dark. He thinks he's invited me to Christmas. What he doesn't know is that I've been waiting 30 years to write my own invitation, the one that will finally belong to me. The letter sat on my kitchen table for days like an uninvited guest I couldn't send away. Each time I passed it, I thought of the last time my son and I spoke, if you can even call it speaking. It was 30 years ago, in a lawyer's office thick with papers and disappointment. My wife had died, and what should have been a moment of family drawing closer turned instead into the crack that split us apart. The inheritance was modest compared to the rumors people whispered. It was steady savings from decades of honest work, an insurance policy that paid out without fuss, and the house that had been our anchor. My son sat across from me, younger then, eyes sharp with ambition. He looked at me as though grief was weakness and money the only cure. "It would be easier if you just signed it over," he said, voice too steady, his fingers tapping the table with the rhythm of impatience. I remember how foreign those words sounded coming from the same boy who once wept when I told him we couldn't afford the baseball glove he wanted for Christmas. I told him the estate would be handled fairly, that his mother's wishes had been put down in writing, instructions for both of us to respect. He called me selfish. He called me a gatekeeper. His voice rose until the lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then my son stood, his chair scraping against the floor like a declaration, and stormed out, his anger echoing down the hall. That was the last image I carried of him, his back rigid, his shoulders squared. A man convinced he had been wronged by the very father who had carried him on those same shoulders decades earlier. Every silence since then grew from that moment, spreading like weeds, strangling the garden of what we once had. So when the invitation to Christmas arrived 30 years later, I didn't hear reconciliation in his words. I heard the ghost of that day in the lawyer's office. I heard the sharpness of his voice, the entitlement that had replaced affection, the inheritance that had turned into our dividing line. When I showed the letter to friends and neighbors, they were far less sentimental than I. "He's not inviting you," one of them said. Her lips pursed over her teacup. "He's inviting your money." Another, more blunt, leaned across my table and tapped the envelope as if it might confess. "Don't fool yourself into thinking this is about Christmas." He saw the article. That's all it took. I nodded because their words rang true. But truth doesn't always make choices easier. For 3 decades, I had survived the emptiness of being ignored. I had patched over the absence with routines, with neighbors who looked out for me, with small rituals that kept me steady. Yet here was a letter a door cracked open, and though I knew the motives behind it were poisoned, some stubborn part of me whispered that perhaps it was time to step through anyway. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to face him again without trembling. I decided I would go, but I would not go empty-handed, and I would not go unprepared. If my son thought he was setting the stage, then he had forgotten who taught him how to perform in the first place. I folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents. It rested there beside trust papers, bank statements, and the will I had updated after my wife's death. It belonged there. This wasn't family correspondence. This was business disguised as sentiment. And business, I had learned, was something I could manage without apology. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows moved like old memories across the plaster. I repeated the same phrase to myself until the rhythm of it pulled me into uneasy sleep. I will go. I will see him again. But I will go on my terms, not his. The morning after I made my decision, I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun pulled itself over the horizon. My house was cold, the kind of chill that makes the floorboards groan under your steps, but I felt sharper than I had in years. A choice had been made, and with it came a strange steadiness. If I was to step back into my son's world after 3 decades of silence, I would not walk in as a father begging for scraps of affection. I would walk in with proof that my life had value beyond what he imagined he could extract from me. I dressed carefully, choosing my old wool coat, the one with deep pockets and a collar that still turned back the wind. Practical, unpretentious, but strong. Then I gathered the folder I had kept hidden for years, the one containing the documents that told the story of my life after he walked away. It was time to bring them into the light. The lawyer's office was warm when I arrived, the kind of place where even the receptionist greeted me by name because I had been a client for so long. My lawyer, Mr. Wallace, had aged alongside me. His hair was thinner, his posture more stooped, but his eyes were as sharp as the first day I sat across from him. When I explained why I was there, he nodded slowly, unsurprised. "That article stirred up attention," he said, adjusting his glasses. "It was bound to." He pulled the documents from his cabinet pages, detailing the trust I had built quietly, carefully, while no one was watching. Decades of saving, of steady investments, of sacrifices made when no one else cared, had grown into something solid, not extravagant, not flashy wealth that made headlines, but strong enough to matter, strong enough that my son had come sniffing after 30 years of silence. Mr. Wallace slid the papers across the desk. "This is airtight," he said. "The charitable trust is protected. The education fund is untouchable, and your personal accounts are in order. He can't touch a cent unless you let him." His words were the confirmation I needed. I nodded, folded the papers back into their envelope, and slipped them into my bag. This was my shield. If my son thought he could corner me at Christmas with charm or pressure, he would find himself facing a wall of signatures, seals, and law stronger than his greed. From there, I went to the bank. The manager, a woman younger than my son, shook my hand with respect and confirmed the accounts again. Numbers printed on the page stared back at me, numbers that represented years of work, discipline, and sacrifice. They were not the sum of me, but they were mine. I had guarded them not because I craved wealth, but because security is dignity when the world tries to erase you. I left the bank with a sealed envelope in my bag, its crisp edges reminding me of the choice I had made. That envelope would travel with me to Christmas, not to hand over, but to hold. Proof that I was not walking into my son's house diminished or desperate. That evening, as I set the papers aside, I thought about what else to bring. I could have chosen an expensive bottle of whiskey or a gift that announced my means, but that would only feed into his performance. Instead, I reached for my old mixing bowls, their glaze cracked with years of use, and decided to bake. My hands moved slowly, remembering the rhythm of recipes from long ago. I sifted flour, cracked eggs, folded sugar into butter, the motions carrying me back to quieter times. I chose a simple cake, the kind I used to make when he was a boy, a spice cake, warm with cinnamon and cloves, a scent that once filled our home and made even winter feel bearable. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to test, to see if, beneath the greed and the years, there was still a man who could taste love in something ordinary. When the cake cooled, I wrapped it in plain paper and tied it with twine instead of ribbon. It was not a performance, not a display, just a father's offering, quiet, unadorned, honest. Beside it, on the table, I placed the sealed envelope containing the documents. One was for the world my son thought he could manipulate. The other was for the world I still hoped might exist, the one where a son could remember the sweetness of home. As I looked at them side by side, the envelope of power and the cake of memory, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Let him invite me for my balance sheet. Let him perform generosity in front of his guests. I would arrive with my own script. He thought he was summoning an old man he had ignored for 30 years. What he would get instead was the father he underestimated, walking through his door not empty, but prepared. The drive to his house felt longer than it was, every mile stretching like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, the cake carefully packed on the floor, and together they seemed to breathe in rhythm with me, steadying me as I approached the place I had not been welcome in for 3 decades. Snow had begun to fall lightly, the kind that swirls like dust when headlights cut through it, and for a moment I wondered if turning back would be the more merciful choice. But I kept going. If 30 years of silence hadn't broken me, neither would one night of forced warmth. His house glowed in the distance, lights strung along the eaves, a tree glittering in the front window tall enough to scrape the ceiling. Cars lined the curb, engines ticking cool, tires pressed into the snow. It looked like the kind of Christmas people send out on glossy cards, all reds and golds and smiling faces. I parked at the edge of the street, slipped the envelope into my bag, picked up the cake, and walked up the shoveled path. The door opened before I could knock. Laughter spilled out with the heat, voices raised in cheer. The kind of noise that once would have made my chest ache with longing. Now it sounded rehearsed, like a stage play, and I was the character they'd written in at the last minute. My son stood there, older of course, though I could still see the bones of the boy I once carried on my shoulders. His hair had thinned, his shoulders widened with middle age, but his smile was wide, too wide, and his voice cracked slightly as he said the word I had not heard from his lips in 30 years. Dad. It was almost a whisper, almost reverent, but also calculated, the way an actor nails a line he knows will draw applause. I studied him, taking in the practiced warmth, the way he leaned in too quickly as though a single embrace could erase decades. He hugged me. His arms were around me, but his heart was somewhere else. I could feel it in the hollowness of the gesture, in the way his eyes flicked over my shoulder to see who was watching. I let him hold me because there was nothing left to lose in allowing it. He ushered me inside with a hand at my back, too staged, too careful, and suddenly the heat and brightness swallowed me whole. The house was crowded, dripping with decorations that looked purchased for effect. Garlands looped with precision, candles lit in every corner, a tree heavy with ornaments that carried no history with me. Strangers filled the rooms, his wife's family, her friends, neighbors perhaps. They looked at me with curiosity, some with polite smiles, others with thin calculation. To them, I was the prodigal father, the guest of honor returning after decades, the man with a whispered story they'd never heard confirmed. My son raised his voice above the chatter. "This is my father," he announced, drawing out the word like he was pulling off a trick, as if revealing a card he'd kept hidden. The room stirred murmurs, a few polite claps, glasses lifted. For a moment, I was at the center of their gaze, not as a man, but as an exhibit. Admired? Yes, but not touched, not known, observed. They seated me near the fire, in a chair too plush, too pointedly placed, like a throne meant for display. My son bent low, asked if I needed water, tea, wine, hovering with a show of care that rang hollow. 30 years of silence could not be covered by mulled cider. I nodded, thanked him, folded my hands. Around me the party swirled laughter, gossip, clinking glasses, children weaving between legs. They treated me as if I were honored, but the honor was a cage. Conversations thinned when I stepped close, flowed freely when I stepped back. They smiled at me the way people smile at a portrait on the wall, valuable, but not alive. My son returned often, each time calling me Dad, louder, sweeter, as if rehearsing a word he had forgotten how to mean. "Dad, did you see the tree? Dad, let me get you another plate. Dad, isn't it wonderful to be together again?" Each dad cut differently, sharp and sweet all at once. A part of me swelled, because I had gone 30 years without hearing it. But the wiser part recognized the strategy underneath. He was performing, not for me, but for them, for his wife's family, for his friends, for the audience that only ever knew me as absence. He wanted to show he had reclaimed something, that he was the kind of man who welcomed his father back, that forgiveness was his gift to give. They didn't know the invitation was not written in love, but in greed. They didn't know he hadn't found me. He'd found my balance sheet. And yet, I sat there, smiling faintly, my bag at my side, the envelope inside it, the cake cooling somewhere on the counter where his wife had set it. I watched him from across the room as he played the role of devoted son, basking in approval. Let him perform, I thought. Let them all watch. I had not come to beg. I had not come to believe. I had come to turn the script on its head, and the curtain had only just risen. Dinner was announced with a flourish, the kind that makes people lower their voices and shuffle toward the table as though ceremony itself makes the meal sacred. The dining room was long, too long, with a polished wood table stretched across it like a stage built for appearances rather than intimacy. Candles burned tall in the center, their light flattering for some but unkind to anyone seated at the far ends. My son guided me to a chair not at his side, not even near the middle, but down toward the far end, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. I sat without protest, my hands resting on the linen napkin folded too precisely in front of me. The chair felt stiff, and in its placement I read everything I needed to know. In a room that claimed to celebrate family, I was positioned as a guest peripheral, convenient, staged. They had written my role long before I arrived. The quiet father, displayed for show, kept at a safe distance. The meal began with the clatter of plates, the passing of bowls, laughter rising and falling like practiced cues. My son, seated at the head of the table, lifted his glass even before the main course was served. "Tonight," he began, his voice warm in sound but hollow in spirit, "we are not just celebrating Christmas. We are celebrating family." The room hushed, waiting for the performance to continue. He let his gaze drift slowly down the length of the table, pausing as if every stop carried weight, and finally settled on me with deliberate tenderness. "After so many years," he said, "I am grateful to have my father here with us. Family is forgiveness, and forgiveness is what keeps us whole." The words were polished, rounded, carefully chosen, but they sat on the air like ornaments too heavy for their branches. Around me I caught whispers the kind people think are hidden but always find their way to the ear they mean to reach. "That's him," someone murmured. "The one from the article." Another voice, sharper. "He set up a trust. Did you hear? Millions, they say." A third voice, low but cynical. "Imagine ignoring your father until he's rich. Now he's here." They thought themselves discreet, but I've lived long enough to hear what others try to bury. I chewed slowly, tasting little of the food, and instead watched the play unfold. My son spoke in long sentences, carefully woven with themes of grace and redemption, presenting himself as the dutiful man who had welcomed back his father. Some nodded along, moved by what they mistook for sincerity. But I knew better. 30 years of silence is not undone by a glass raised high or words crafted for applause. Silence like that burrows into bone. It lingers in the walls of a house. It becomes its own language. And once learned, you never forget it. My fork hovered over my plate as I studied him. His smile stretched at the right places. His voice dipped at the rehearsed moments. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked constantly toward the guests, searching for approval, glancing at me only long enough to confirm I was still seated in my place. It wasn't love he sought, it was validation. It wasn't me he wanted, it was what I represented. To him, I was no longer a father. I was leverage, proof to the room that he could summon forgiveness when it suited him. My place at the table was more than physical. It was symbolic. Too far down to matter, too close to ignore. His wife played her part as well, thanking me loudly for the cake I'd brought, turning it into a spectacle. She smiled as though it was quaint, an old man's gesture, the relic of someone who baked instead of signing checks. Her tone wasn't gratitude, it was display, a prop in the evening's production. I smiled faintly and said little. Let them perform. Let them believe they were staging a reunion. They didn't realize I had walked in not to play their part, but to prepare my own. The main course arrived, ham glazed to shine, potatoes drowned in cream, green beans heavy with butter. I lowered my gaze to the plate, not out of shame, but because the falseness was easier to bear when I didn't meet their eyes. Conversation swelled, laughter rose and fell, and my son continued to weave his narrative, casting himself as the redeemer of a story he once abandoned. Every so often, he threw crumbs of attention my way, raising his voice so it carried down the table. "Dad, remember how you used to carve the turkey every Christmas?" I nodded, though the memory carried more weight than he knew. "Dad, didn't you always tell us to open one gift at midnight?" Again, I nodded. He wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking through me, to the audience, using my history as his script. I sat in silence and let his words wash past like cold water. The truth was simple. He hadn't found me out of love. He hadn't invited me out of longing. He had read my name in print, seen numbers beside it, and decided Christmas was the perfect stage. They thought they had arranged my return, But what they couldn't see not yet was that I hadn't come to play the part they had written. I was not seated at the end of the table because I was small. I was seated there because, from that distance, I could see the whole play unfold. And when the curtain finally fell, it would not be his applause that remained. It would be my silence, deliberate, unshakable, that echoed loudest of all. It was after dinner when the performance began to loosen at the edges, the way even the most carefully rehearsed plays eventually betray their seams. Plates had been cleared, glasses refilled, and the guests had broken into smaller clusters around the living room. Laughter came in bursts now, uneven and scattered, as people grew comfortable enough to stop pretending. I had been left near the fire again, a cup of lukewarm tea warming my hands, nodding politely at anyone who passed but never truly included in their circles. My son moved easily among them, his voice rising just enough that I could hear it drift across the room. Every word, every laugh was still theater, but the audience was tiring. Their applause had grown thin. That was when I heard it, the slip. I rose quietly to stretch my legs, carrying the teacup into the hallway that led toward the kitchen. The laughter faded behind me, replaced by the muffled clink of dishes and voices lowered in a rush. I slowed, not from caution but instinct, and stopped just short of the doorway. That was when their words reached me. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp even when hushed, cut through the air. "If we get him to sign tonight, it's done." There was a pause, then my son's reply, low and certain. "He won't say no. Not here. Not with everyone watching." My breath caught not from shock, but from recognition. The letter, the sudden invitation, the new warmth in his voice, all of it snapped into clarity like puzzle pieces pressing into place. This was no reunion. It was a transaction dressed in Christmas lights. They hadn't wanted me here because I was missed. They wanted me here because they thought I was weak, an old man softened by years, desperate to hear the word Dad spoken aloud, lonely enough to sign away everything I had built. My fingers tightened around the cup, porcelain pressing hard into my palm. But my heart was steady now. The ache of 30 years condensed into something sharp and defined. Not grief, not longing, strategy. Their whispers carried on, unaware of how close I was. "He's sentimental," my daughter-in-law urged. "We'll remind him of the past. He'll want to leave a legacy. Tonight is perfect." And then my son again, his voice almost rehearsed. "If we get his signature before the new year, we can move quickly. No delays." I stepped back into the shadows, the tea trembling faintly in my hand, though my pulse did not. Pain has a way of stripping things bare, leaving only the truth behind. The fog of wishful thinking cleared. 30 years of silence had already taught me endurance. Now, their greed gave me clarity. They thought I was the frail father, easily swayed by nostalgia, ready to bless their ambition with a pen stroke at the bottom of a page. They thought wrong. As I walked back toward the fire, I thought of the envelope resting in my bag, the trust papers sealed and ironclad, untouchable by them or anyone else. I thought of the simple cake I had baked, cooling in their kitchen, unadorned, made to test whether they could still recognize love without price tags. I thought of the seat they had given me at the far end of the table, not a place of honor but a place of observation. And from there, I had seen everything I needed. They believed they had written the script, but what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that I had walked into their theater with one of my own. My years had taught me the difference between reaction and strategy. I would not storm into the kitchen. I would not confront them while their guests lingered in the next room. No, I would let them think I had heard nothing. I would let them carry on their play, confident in their deception. And when the curtain fell, I would deliver the line they had never rehearsed for. Back in that stiff chair by the fire, I lifted the cooling tea to my lips and let it cover the smallest of smiles. They thought they had slipped only in whispers. What they had really done was hand me the map of their intentions. And I, who had endured 30 years of silence, knew better than anyone how to turn silence into strength. It happened the way I knew it would, not with subtlety, but with a flourish meant to draw the eyes of everyone in the room. My son stood at the head of the table, his glass lifted high, his voice cutting above the laughter and chatter of guests who had already had too much wine and sugar. "Before we open gifts," he announced, "I think it's only right that my father says a few words." His eyes flicked toward me, expectant, commanding, as though this moment was natural, as though 3 decades of silence could be punctured with a toast and the room would walk away believing in his redemption. A murmur of agreement moved through the guests. Heads turned, faces softened, eager. To them, I was the long-absent patriarch returning at last. The silence finally broken. The family made whole again. They wanted a speech of blessing, something that would stitch over the gaps of years with sentiment polished enough to toast. My son leaned forward slightly, his smile sharp, rehearsed. "Dad," he said louder, "say something for us. A toast." It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in charm. I felt their eyes pressing against me, waiting, weighing, curious. I let the silence stretch. I sipped from my glass, the cider bitter, grounding. My heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed, steady, deliberate, as though it knew the truth it carried had waited 30 years for this moment. Finally, I stood. I lifted my glass, letting the candlelight catch the rim, and scanned the room. My gaze lingered on each face just long enough for them to understand that what I was about to say was not a performance. When I spoke, my voice was calm, even the kind of voice people listen to whether they want to or not. "Some invitations," I began, "are written with love." Several nodded, their smiles softening, certain they knew where I was headed, certain I was about to give them the warmth they wanted. I let the pause stretch before continuing. "And some invitations," I said, "are written with greed." The room stiffened. Smiles faltered. My son's hand froze midair, glass suspended, eyes darting nervously across the table. I kept my tone steady, deliberate. "Tonight, I accept the invitation," I said, raising my glass a fraction higher, "but not the terms." For a heartbeat, the room held still. The words settled heavy, sinking into the polished wood, into the garland strung too carefully, into the crystal glasses suddenly dulled by truth. A few shifted in their seats, whispers breaking like cracks across the table. My son tried to recover with a laugh too quick, too thin, the laugh of a man who knows the script has slipped from his hands. "Dad has always had a way with words," he said, his voice strained, pitched higher than before. But no one joined his laugh. The weight of what I'd said lingered. I saw his wife's face flush, her hand clutching her napkin as though she might tear it. A cousin leaned back in his chair, reassessing me, his gaze sharper now. The guests who had whispered earlier about my wealth now looked at me not with politeness but with recognition, waiting for confirmation. I lowered my glass but did not drink. I let the silence grow. My words had cracked the performance wide open, and the cracks were spreading. The laughter that followed was brittle. The conversations that resumed stumbled and faltered. My son lifted his glass again, desperate, voice too loud. "To family," he declared. A few echoed him, weakly, the words limp and hollow. I sat slowly, folding my napkin across my lap, cider untouched. I had not blessed the performance. I had not lent my voice to his illusion. Instead, I had given them truth that needed no applause, only recognition. Some invitations come from love, some come from greed, and I had made it clear to everyone in that room which kind had brought me there. The rest of the evening never recovered. My son's eyes no longer dared to meet mine. His charm faltered, his laughter broke uneven, and his performance, once smooth, was now jagged at the edges. He had wanted me to close his play with a blessing. Instead, I had ended it with a toast that left no room for pretense. And truth, once spoken, refuses to be ignored. The silence that followed my toast lingered in the air like smoke after a candle is snuffed out, heavy and acrid, refusing to be ignored. My son shifted in his chair at the head of the table, his forced smile already slipping, the mask he had so carefully worn through the evening cracking at its edges. I could feel the unease pressing in around us, the weight of 100 unspoken words. It was then that I reached down beside my chair, into the bag that had never left my side all night. My fingers closed around the envelope, thick with papers, sealed with the weight of 3 decades of independence and foresight. I laid it on the table before me, not hurried, not dramatic, but with the calm finality of someone placing the last piece in a puzzle. The candlelight caught the crisp white edge, and I could see eyes dart toward it. Curiosity mingled with tension. My son's gaze fixed on the envelope instantly. His shoulders stiffened, his hand still hovering around his wine glass. "What's that?" he asked, his voice too sharp for the room he wanted to appear in control of. I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I let my hand rest on the envelope as though steadying something more fragile than paper. Then, when the silence grew too loud to ignore, I spoke. "You asked me here tonight under the banner of family, but family cannot be bought or staged. So let me tell you what cannot be bought." I slid the envelope forward across the table so that the guests, his in-laws and friends, could see it, though I never once let my eyes leave his. "This," I said firmly, "is proof that every cent I own has already been placed into an ironclad charitable trust and an education fund. It is secure. It cannot be touched. Not by you. Not by anyone at this table." A sharp intake of breath spread through the room, a ripple of gasps that seemed to travel faster than sound itself. Glasses were set down too quickly. Forks clattered against plates. Whispers ignited like dry leaves in fire. My son's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing without sound before he managed. "What? No, what do you mean?" His voice cracked, panic leaking through the veneer of control. He looked from me to the envelope, then to the faces around the table, searching for someone, anyone, to laugh it off, to join him in pretending it was nothing. No one did. "You heard me," I said, my tone steady, each word carrying the weight of years he had abandoned me. "The assets you thought were dangling within reach have already been given away, to scholarships for children who need a chance, to a library that will carry stories longer than you carried my name, to a shelter where women can find safety when no one else will give it, to things that outlast greed." His wife shifted uncomfortably, her hand gripping the edge of the table as though bracing herself against a tide. My son shook his head, his voice rising, shrill now, no longer a performance but a protest. "You can't just, Dad. You can't just lock everything away like that. It's not fair. I'm your son." He said the word son, like it was a legal claim, like it was a birthright that granted him entitlement. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself to lean forward, my hands folded calmly over one another. "You are my son by blood," I said, "but family is not measured in blood alone. Family is measured in presence, in care, in time. For 30 years you gave me none of those things. You forfeited your claim the day you decided silence was easier than love." Murmurs grew louder now among the guests. Some looked at me with quiet admiration, others at him with thinly veiled judgment. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the wood floor. "You don't understand what you're doing," he snapped. "You're making a mistake. You're humiliating me in front of everyone. You've always held things back from me, and now you're protecting what is mine," I interrupted softly, cutting through his tirade without raising my voice. "Not from the world, from you." His eyes widened, fury warring with desperation. He pointed at the envelope as though it were a weapon. "You brought this here just to shame me." "No," I said, my gaze never faltering. "I brought this here so you would know the truth, and so there would be no illusion left to cling to. I will not be manipulated. I will not be tricked into signing anything under the glitter of Christmas lights." I came prepared. His protest tumbled out then, incoherent, a rush of "you can't," and "this isn't right," and "I'm your child." But the guests had already seen enough. Their eyes no longer followed him as they had earlier in the evening when he played the role of gracious son. Now they followed me, their silence lending weight to the truth I had laid bare. He tried one last time, his voice breaking into pleading. "Dad, please. We can talk about this later. Just you and me. You don't have to But I cut him off again, my voice colder this time. "The time for private conversations ended 30 years ago when you left me in silence. This conversation is public because you made it public when you staged this dinner as your performance. Tonight, the curtain falls." He collapsed back into his chair, his face twisted, his hands clenched into fists. The whispers grew into a hum around the room, people shifting, avoiding his eyes, leaning closer to one another with the electricity of scandal. The envelope sat on the table between us, untouched, but it might as well have been made of stone. It was immovable, undeniable. My son had invited me to Christmas, believing he was opening a door to my fortune. Instead, I had closed it in his face and locked it forever. For a moment, after my words settled, the room hung in that peculiar silence where no one dares move first. The envelope lay between us like a verdict carved in stone, and my son sat rigid, his jaw tightening, his hands curled into fists as though gripping something that kept slipping through his fingers. Then, as if some dam within him finally broke, he surged to his feet. The chair skidded harshly against the polished wood, the sound sharp enough to make several guests flinch. His face was flushed, his composure gone. "Betrayal," he spat, his voice rising high and ugly. "That's what this is. After everything I've done, after everything I've built, you come in here and humiliate me in front of my family, in front of my friends? You call yourself my father?" His voice cracked on the last word. More rage than sorrow. The polite mask he had worn all evening, the tender dad he'd rehearsed so carefully, was stripped away in an instant, revealing the raw, entitled anger that had been simmering underneath. I didn't speak. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching him the way one watches a storm they knew was always coming. The room recoiled from him as though the very air had changed. Where there had been smiles and nods, there was now discomfort. Eyes shifted to the floor, to plates, to anything but him. A woman near the middle of the table muttered something to her husband that sounded like, "Shameful," and he nodded gravely. My son's voice rose louder, desperate to command the room again. "You've always been selfish," he shouted, stabbing his finger toward me as if to drive the accusation into my chest. "Always hoarding, always keeping things to yourself. Mom worked her whole life for us, for me. And what did you do? You kept it. You locked it away. You decided you were the only one who deserved it." His words echoed in the stunned room, and for the first time all night, I saw people shift away from him, not toward him. The whispers were not in my direction now. They were in his. The in-laws exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering too plainly to be mistaken. "How could he speak to him like that?" one voice said. "After 30 years? Another whispered. The cousins who had smiled at him earlier leaned back in their chairs. The admiration in their eyes drained away. He was unraveling before them, and there was no performance polished enough to save him. I let him rage, my silence deliberate, my calm the sharpest contrast to his fury. He slammed his palm against the table, rattling glasses and startling one of the children who whimpered until their mother pulled them close. His wife, my daughter-in-law, rushed forward then, her voice pitched high, her hand reaching for his arm. "Darling, stop," she urged, her eyes darting nervously at the guests who stared in open discomfort. "This isn't the time, not in front of everyone. Please, sit down. Let's talk privately." But her attempt at intervention only fueled the fire. He pulled his arm away from her with a jerk so sharp it nearly toppled her glass of wine. "No," he snapped at her, the word venomous. "Don't tell me to stop. He's been playing this game for years, and you think I'm going to sit here and let him make me the villain in my own home?" The words "my own home" struck the air like a brand, full of misplaced ownership, full of entitlement. The room recoiled further. One guest coughed awkwardly. Another muttered, "Disgraceful." My daughter-in-law's face went pale, but still she pressed forward, trying to regain control of the disaster unfolding. "He's your father," she said through clenched teeth, her own mask of politeness slipping under the strain. "People are watching. Stop shouting at him." And her attempt at reason fell flat, swallowed by his fury. He turned on her, his voice booming with the force of a man who believed volume could erase truth. "You wanted this too," he barked. "Don't act like you didn't. You told me to invite him. You told me this was the moment. You said if we didn't act now, we'd lose everything." Gasps rang out, sharp and collective. The kind of sound a crowd makes when a secret becomes spectacle. The last pretense of civility was gone. The careful script burned to ashes in his own hands. His mask had slipped, and now all that remained was the greed, the bitterness, the entitlement laid bare before the entire room. I sat unmoving, my eyes steady on him, letting the quiet dignity of my stillness weigh heavier than his shouting ever could. Around us, the judgment of others fell swift and unforgiving. Heads shook, eyes narrowed. Some turned away from him entirely, unable to stomach the sight of a grown man tearing at the very father who had carried him into this world. "Enough," an older man at the table said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised children of his own. "You should be ashamed." My son's mouth opened as if to protest, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, searching for allies and finding none. His wife, red-faced and trembling, tried to guide him back into his seat, but her touch was shrugged off once more. He stood there, trembling with rage, stripped bare of the performance he had spent the entire evening perfecting. And I, his father, the man he had ignored for 30 years, sat at the far end of the table with my back straight, my silence louder than his outburst, my calmness sharper than his fury. For the first time in decades, the power between us had shifted. The room knew it. He knew it. And there was no undoing what had just been revealed. The shouting had already collapsed into silence, the kind that suffocates a room because no one knows how to breathe inside it. My son stood trembling at the head of the table, his face twisted with anger and humiliation, while the guests looked anywhere but at him, their discomfort palpable, their judgment already sealed. The envelope lay on the table like a verdict, untouched, immovable, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt lighter, as though the burden I had carried in my chest had been set down where everyone could see it. I didn't need to say another word, but I knew the moment demanded one. Slowly, I pushed back my chair. The sound was soft compared to the violence of his outburst, but it carried further than his shouting had. Every head turned toward me as I rose. I smoothed the napkin, placed it neatly on the table, then reached for my bag where the envelope had been kept safe all evening. My fingers brushed against the wool of my coat draped across the back of the chair. I lifted it carefully, slid my arms into the sleeves with the precision of someone preparing for the cold, not for a fight. No one moved to stop me. They only watched. My son's voice, stripped now of bravado, cracked as he said, "Dad, don't leave like this." His plea stumbled over itself, weak, without conviction. I met his eyes, not with anger, but with the quiet clarity of someone who has endured too much to be moved by theatrics. I held his gaze for a long moment, then turned to the room, letting my words find not just him, but every witness who had been part of this charade. "For 30 years, I began, my voice steady, deliberate. You ignored me. The weight of the sentence pressed down, undeniable. I let it breathe before continuing. Tonight, I ignored your performance. I let my eyes sweep the table, letting the silence after each phrase carve itself into the air. Then I finished, softly, but with finality. We are even now." No one spoke. The words hung there like frost clinging to glass, unshakable, undeniable. My son opened his mouth, but whatever argument he had left died before it reached his tongue. His wife's hand hovered near his arm, but she didn't touch him this time. She knew nothing, she said, would patch what had just unraveled in front of everyone. I lifted my chin, my shoulders square beneath the coat, and turned toward the door. My steps were not hurried. Each one landed with purpose, a rhythm of resolve that echoed through the silence of the house. I passed the glittering tree in the front window, its ornaments shining too brightly, too falsely, and I thought how little it resembled the trees of my past trees decorated with homemade paper stars and strings of popcorn, trees that carried love rather than performance. I reached the door, placed my hand on the knob, and opened it to the night. The cold hit me instantly, sharp and clean, the snow still falling in slow, quiet spirals that caught the light of the street lamps. It felt honest out there, more honest than anything inside that house had been all evening. I stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and pulled the coat tighter around me. My breath rose in the air, visible, steady, proof that I was still here, still standing, still mine. Behind me, the house hummed faintly with muffled voices, but I did not turn back. I had given them my final word. I had returned not to reclaim love, but to reclaim myself, and I had done it. My head was high as I walked down the shoveled path, past the rows of cars lined in the street. The world was quiet but for the snow, the kind of quiet that feels like absolution. 30 years of silence had brought me here, and tonight I had given silence back to him, on my terms. For once, the scales felt balanced. At the curb I paused, lifted my face to the falling snow, and let it sting my cheeks. It was not sorrow I felt. It was not bitterness. It was peace, the peace of knowing that I had spoken the truth and walked away whole. And as I stepped into the night, leaving the warmth of the false house behind, I knew this was the beginning, not the end, of my freedom. The snow met me with silence, the kind that soaks through every sound and leaves only the crunch of your own footsteps to remind you that you're still part of the world. My breath curled in the air like small ghosts escaping with every exhale, but I didn't mind the cold. It was cleaner than anything I'd left behind inside that house. The false warmth of candles and chandeliers was replaced by something simpler, sharper, the honest bite of winter. I had barely taken a few steps down the path when I saw a figure standing at the curb. At first, I thought it was one of the guests sneaking out for air, someone curious to watch the aftermath. But then the streetlight caught her face, and I realized it was Emma, the neighbor girl from 2 doors down. Barely 20, but with an old soul I'd come to recognize. She had grown up watching me shovel my own walk, carrying my groceries with a stubborn independence. I knew she admired, even if she didn't always understand it. Over the years, she'd stopped by now and then to check in, dropping off cookies at Christmas or flowers in the spring. She had been a constant, quiet presence, the kind of loyalty that didn't demand anything in return. Tonight, she stood with a thermos in her hands, her cheeks flushed from the cold, a knitted hat pulled low over her ears. "I thought you might need this," she said, holding it out to me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I took it, the metal warm against my fingers, and unscrewed the top. The scent of cocoa rose immediately, rich and familiar, steam curling up into the night. I took a sip, the sweetness filling my mouth, and for the first time that evening, something felt genuine. "You didn't have to wait out here in the cold," I told her, my voice softer than it had been at the table, stripped of its armor. She shrugged, smiling in that easy way she always did. Sometimes people need someone waiting outside. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried more weight than any speech I had heard inside the house. She reached into her pocket then and pulled out a small, awkwardly wrapped parcel. The paper was crinkled, the tape uneven, but it was tied with a ribbon that had clearly been chosen with care. She held it out to me. "It's not much," she said quickly, almost apologetically, "but it's Christmas, and you deserve to open something that's just for you." My throat tightened as I took the little package. The weight was light, but the gesture was heavy, anchored in a sincerity that had been missing all evening. I peeled the paper slowly, not rushing, wanting to honor the gift with patience. Inside was a pair of knitted mittens, the yarn, a deep blue, flecked with silver. They were imperfect, one thumb a little shorter than the other, but when I slid them on, they fit as though they had been made for me all along. "I made them myself," Emma said, her voice nervous now. "I thought they might keep your hands warm when you're out walking." I flexed my fingers inside them, the warmth already seeping into my skin. "They're perfect," I said, and meant it. Better than any jeweled trinket, better than any envelope stuffed with checks. These mittens had been made stitch by stitch, thread by thread, by someone who thought of me without wanting anything in return. Inside the house behind us, the muffled sound of raised voices seeped through the walls. The chaos of my son's unraveling, carrying on without me. I could imagine him shouting, his wife pleading, the guests gathering their coats with embarrassed excuses. It was noise born of greed, of entitlement, of masks torn away. But out here, under the falling snow, there was no noise. Only the two of us, a thermos of cocoa, and the gift of hands that had chosen to create warmth rather than demand it. I leaned against the lamppost, sipping again from the thermos, the steam fogging the edge of my glasses. "Do you know," I said quietly, "I've sat at a table tonight where the food was plenty and the candles glowed, and yet I felt nothing but cold. And now here I am, standing in the snow with you, and for the first time tonight I feel warm." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening not with pity but with understanding. "That's because family isn't always who's inside the house," she said. "Sometimes it's who's waiting for you outside it." I let the words settle into me, not as comfort, but as truth. She was right. Blood had abandoned me. Performance had tried to claim me, but here was loyalty, quiet and unassuming, standing on a snowy curb with mittens and cocoa. That was family too, maybe the truest kind. I looked down the street, the lamps glowing halos in the snowfall, and realized that what I had lost inside that house was not worth grieving anymore. What I had found here, in this simple moment, was enough, more than enough. I slipped my arm gently through Emma's, the way a grandfather might steady himself on his granddaughter, though in truth it was not my balance I needed, it was the connection. Together we walked slowly down the street, the snow crunching beneath our boots, leaving twin trails behind us. Behind us, the house still hummed with chaos, voices raised in anger and shame, but ahead of us stretched the night, quiet and honest. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt that I was not walking alone. The days that followed carried a silence different from the one I had known for 30 years. This silence was not born of abandonment or neglect, but of a story finally finding its way into the world. It began quietly, like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading wider than I expected. By the end of the week, the news had broken. The trust was public. It was no longer just words tucked inside an envelope I had placed on a Christmas table. It was documented, notarized, and listed in the paper under Community Gifts of the Year. My name sat there, not in bold, not with fanfare, but in the quiet dignity of print that spoke of permanence. Scholarships for children who had nothing but potential. A community center for families who had been told too many times they didn't belong. Shelters for women who had only ever been defined by the doors slammed in their faces. The articles didn't romanticize me. They didn't call me generous or saintly. They simply reported what had been secured, what had been made untouchable. And somehow that truth, that simplicity, was the greatest relief. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what the money could do when it was no longer an object of greed, but a tool for survival and growth. Letters began to arrive soon after. At first, just a few handwritten notes from people I had never met. A boy from across town whose sister had been accepted into the first wave of scholarships wrote, "She thought college was just for other people. Now she believes it's for her too." A woman from the shelter sent a card that simply read, "A warm bed tonight. Thank you." Over the next week, the trickle became a flood. Envelopes piled on my small kitchen table until I had to fetch an old basket from the closet just to keep them contained. Some came with shaky handwriting, others typed, some even drawn in crayon by children who wrote things like, "Thank you for helping my mom smile again." Each letter was a reminder that what I had lost in 30 years of silence was being rewritten in voices I had never heard before but somehow recognized. Gratitude from strangers filled the void my son had left. They gave me words he never had, acknowledgement, respect, thanks, and in those voices, I found a kind of family he had refused to be. Meanwhile, his story was spreading too, but not in the way he wanted. Whispers followed him like shadows. The same people who had clapped politely at his speeches, who had sipped wine and nodded at his performance, now spoke in low voices when his name came up. "Did you hear?" they said in grocery store aisles. 30 years he ignored him. 30 years, and then invited him back just to get him to sign. Others shook their heads, pity mixing with disgust. Imagine turning Christmas into a business deal. His reputation, once polished like the shine on his dinner table, now cracked in ways no amount of charm could repair. People saw him differently, not as the accomplished man with connections and ambition, but as the son who had tried to stage manage his own father. He could not undo what had been revealed, because too many had seen it with their own eyes. And gossip, once it finds the taste of scandal, never forgets it. The whispers weren't cruel, they were damning in their simplicity. Greed, they said. Entitlement, words that linger longer than shouts. I heard from a friend at the market that his business partners were uneasy now, that investors were asking questions about judgment and trustworthiness. If he'd do that to his own father, one reportedly said, what would he do to us? He had spent years building a reputation in public, and in one night, his own actions had collapsed it in private. The collapse didn't make me rejoice. I felt no triumph, no victory. What I felt was balance, finally, after decades. For years, I had carried the weight of his rejection, the loneliness of his silence. Now he carried the weight of his choices, not because I had punished him, but because he had revealed himself. And the world, once dazzled by his performance, finally saw what I had always known. I spent my mornings with Coco at the table, opening letters, writing brief replies when I could. In the afternoons, I walked to the library where a quiet corner had been dedicated already to the scholarship program. A corkboard pinned with photographs of the first recipients. Their faces were lit with possibility, not obligation. I would stand there sometimes, mittened hands folded behind my back, and think, this is what family looks like when it chooses you back. At night, I sat by my window with the snow still piled high on the sill, watching the town move in its slow winter rhythm. Somewhere out there, my son was pacing, trying to salvage the pieces of a reputation shattered by his own hands. But I did not think of him with malice. I thought of him with the clarity of a man who had been both ignored and finally heard. My life was no longer defined by his absence. It was defined by what I had built in spite of it. And as I folded the last letter of the day, a child's drawing of a tree with the words, "Thank you, Grandpa," scribbled beneath, I realized that family is not only blood. Sometimes, it is the strangers who choose you, the ones who write your name not to demand, but to give thanks. And for the first time in 3 decades, I felt that I had been chosen. The night I came home after everything, the house greeted me not with silence, but with the kind of stillness that comforts. The porch light glowed faintly on the snow, casting long shadows across the walkway, and when I opened the door, the scent of pine drifted out to meet me. My little tree stood in the corner. No grandeur, no expensive ornaments, just the same box of lights I had used for years. They blinked unevenly, a few bulbs refusing to work no matter how many times I twisted them, but their glow was steady enough to warm the room. I hung my coat on the hook, set down my bag, and let myself breathe. The kind of breath you only take when you've stepped back into a space that belongs entirely to you. The quiet was not empty. It was full of everything I had chosen, full of the decisions that were mine alone. I poured myself a cup of tea, sweetened just the way I liked, and carried it to my chair by the tree. Outside, snow still drifted in lazy spirals under the street lamp, and the window pane shivered softly in the wind. I sat there, watching the lights blink against the glass ornaments, the mismatched angels, the faded stars cut from cardboard decades ago. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. For the first time in 30 years, I felt no ache waiting for a voice that would never call, no weight pressing down on me to forgive what had never been asked honestly. Instead, I felt a lightness, like a stone finally lifted from the chest I'd carried too long. On the side table lay a small envelope, hand-delivered earlier in the day by Emma, the neighbor girl who had waited for me in the snow. She had slipped it into my mailbox with mittens still damp from the weather. I hadn't opened it yet, saving it for when the house was quiet and the night asked me to listen closely. I picked it up now, running my fingers over the flap, and opened it with care. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakably hers, looping and uneven, with a few words smudged where her pen must have lingered too long. I read it slowly, each word sinking deep. You were never alone, you just had to stop waiting for the wrong person to open the door. I held the note in my hands for a long time, tracing the letters as though they were carved into the page. The truth of it pierced me, but not with pain, with clarity. For 30 years, I had sat in a house listening for a knock that never came, hoping for reconciliation from a son who had chosen silence. I had mistaken absence for punishment, and I had let that punishment shape me. But I had not been alone. There were neighbors who shoveled without asking, children who waved from bicycles, letters that came from strangers who found hope in a scholarship or shelter. There had always been people willing to open the door. I had simply been too focused on the one who kept it closed. The tea warmed my hands, the tree glowed faintly, and Emma's words echoed in the quiet. Stop waiting for the wrong person. I folded the note carefully and tucked it between the pages of my journal, a place where I kept truths worth remembering. My eyes drifted back to the tree, and I let the years roll through me. Christmas mornings when my son was small, when his laugh filled this room, when love felt unshakable. Then the long years after, when the tree stood alone, decorated but never admired. And finally, tonight, when the tree bore witness not to loss, but to peace. For the first time in decades, Christmas was not a wound I pressed against. It was not a stage for disappointment. It was a season I could claim again, not because my son had returned to me, but because I had returned to myself. I sat back in the chair, the lights blinking gently, and let the peace settle. The truth had cost me years, but it had given me something my son's belated affection never could: freedom. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the street in quiet, erasing the footprints that led away from the chaos I had left behind. The world was clean again, ready for something new. I closed my eyes, holding Emma's words close like a gift more valuable than any jeweled box or envelope of cash. And when I opened them, the house was no longer heavy with waiting. It was alive with the soft glow of lights, the hum of the furnace, the small sound of a man at peace in his own home. I smiled then, not for anyone else, not as a mask or a performance, but for myself. Christmas was not stolen from me, I whispered into the quiet room. It was returned not by the son who abandoned me, but by the truth I chose to keep.